I left my heart in San Francisco. Now, they may be song lyrics, but for some really hardcore pro wrestling fans out there, that's true for them as well, and it has been for several decades. As the Bay Area was once the site of some major turf warfare between the National Wrestling Alliance and an upstart outlaw promotion. But sometimes you gotta do whatever it takes, with the winner not only coming out on top, but also making it to the big time. And that's the topic of this episode. Because today... Please support this channel by subscribing, and you could support it even further by signing up over on my Patreon page, just like Mr. J and Freehand and the rest of my amazing, awesome Patreon supporters. Thank all of you so much. Okay, so right off the bat, to clarify some things, there have been a lot of promotions out there calling themselves Big Time Wrestling. So for today's episode, we're specifically focusing on the San Francisco version. If there's another version you'd like to hear about in a future episode, well, let me know down in the comments. Anyway, let's go ahead and begin the video. From the beginning, the California wrestling scene was quite different from the rest of the country, as they were for the most part pretty far away from the rest of the professional wrestling scene. But there was one man that was trying to change all that, Joe Mousewitch. Nicknamed the Utica Panther, Joe became the name when it came to San Francisco wrestling, but he was most noted for being a promoter despite being a 3-time world champion. Our story begins in 1935, with Joe already promoting for a number of years. But what is significant here is that in this year, the Utica Panther would purchase the majority rights to the new Dreamland Auditorium, which would eventually be known as the Winterland Arena. Now, back in those days, having a venue to call your own did a lot for your business, as it was all about live attendance. Although relying on live attendance too much can be a problem, but we'll be getting to that in a little bit. Continuing on. Based off of the success that Joe was seeing from the future Winterland Arena, Joe was able to expand his territory, moving into the market of Northern California as well as Nevada. And as time went on, Mousewitch would eventually join up with the NWA, becoming an early adopter of the Alliance and becoming NWA San Francisco, which only reaffirmed that his was the promotion to work for if you want to wrestle in the Bay Area. And throughout this period, there were those who tried to take the Panther down, but they just couldn't get the job done. And one such contender to the throne just happened to be the biggest box office draw of all time with Jim Londos. Now, before television ratings and pay-per-view buys and merchandise sales, Jim Londos was the guy who brought in all the money when it came to professional wrestling, as it was said that he regularly drew 80 to 100,000 on average. And if that's true, that is a lot of revenue. But even with that kind of drawing power, Joe still had the other kind of political power and maintained his control over the San Francisco scene. At least, for a while. After stepping away from the squared circle due to a severe knee injury, Professor Roy Shire decided to try his hand at promoting. And despite wrestling for the NWA San Francisco and wrestling under Joe for several years, the Professor decided that he was gonna bite the hand that feeds, and he would go against the very man that he worked for all that time. In 1960, Roy Shire created the Pacific Coast Athletic Corporation, and he did so in conjunction with the California State Athletic Commission. And thus, going against the direct territory system of the National Wrestling Alliance, this created an outlaw promotion, which does indeed predate the emancipation from the Capital Wrestling Corporation, which is now the company we know as WWE. Now, up until this point, the Utica Panther was a well-respected man in the industry, and for good reason. He worked with other territories, he even collaborated from time to time with Rikidozan in Japan. However, the times they are a-changin', and good old Joe's old-fashioned ways weren't gonna last forever, as it seemed to some that he was very much out of touch, especially when it came to this newfangled invention called the television. For you see, Joe believed that television exposure would diminish that of his live attendance. However, Shire fully embraced that of TV, getting on to a new independent television station called KTVU, airing a hit show on Friday nights. Now, this program did so good that it warranted a second wrestling program from the company, one called Big Time Wrestling, which would air on KCRA in Sacramento. San Francisco was soon becoming the home of the Professor, and a home was exactly what his promotion was about to get. Originally known as the California Livestock Pavilion, as we now know it today, the Cow Palace has held some amazing events throughout its history. But to true fans, the Cow Palace will always be the place that held some of the very best professional wrestling ever. Now, the first show that Shire had at the Cow Palace happened in March of 1961, featuring its main event, Bill Melby and Mitsu Arakawa. Raw, and this would draw over 16,500 fans, which was a stark contrast to a show held by Mousewitz that only drew 2,800 people in attendance. This resulted in the Utica Panther having to close the doors to his promotion, and Roy Shire collecting the W. Now, of course, Shire didn't do this on his own, as he also partnered up with other promotions who were looking to get away from the stranglehold of the National Wrestling Alliance, such as the WWA. And together, they proved that the Alliance didn't have a lot of sure footing when it came to the West Coast, combating them with a major star, Classy Freddie Blassie, who I've already talked about in a previous video, that I collaborated with Wrestling Bios on. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you check it out. Now, in addition to Blassie, there were many other stars such as Ray Stevens as well as Pepper Gomez, not to mention Stevens' eventual tag partner of Pat Patterson, who together formed the Blonde Bombers. And in addition to his stars, Roy also relied heavily on his bookers, Johnny Doyle and eventually Red Bastian. And they would produce professional wrestling that was high action, filled with high spots, but also maintained realism. Eventually, Ray Stevens would become the promotion's top heel, and their flagship show would be an annual 18-man battle royal. But while that was their big yearly event, let's not forget about the show that happened every single week. Because, similar to what happened to Impact Wrestling, this promotion was now known by its flagship show, Big Time Wrestling. And despite originally being an enemy to the National Wrestling Alliance, the promotion would join the NWA in 1968, and the professor himself would be vice president of the organization for a number of years in the early 70s. However, this is where everything began to roll downhill. In 1970, while the show was still popular at the time, KTVU forbade Shire from producing his show there due to him constantly spitting tobacco juice on the floor of the studio, despite being told not to. And his headstrong attitude also caused problems with another television station, KTXL. As the decade went on, live attendance and television ratings began to drop, coupled with Roy Shire's backstage problems with television stations, resulted in Big Time Wrestling officially getting cancelled in 1979. And so, without the ability to tape his own programming, he was relying on getting tape from other promoters. First attempting to co-promote with Portland's own Don Owen, but to no avail, as well as having a very brief partnership with Kansas City. He would then soon turn to Eddie Graham, with the San Francisco fan base really taking to that of the CWF. However, the price of flying wrestlers from Florida to California was just way too costly, and after just 3 shows at the Cow Palace, this arrangement too was done. This would all lead to the AWA's Vern Gagne, who swooped in to take over television coverage in the San Francisco Bay Area, thus giving the professor Roy Shire no choice but to throw in the towel as he retired from promoting in 1981. Yup, that's right. In a rare twist, we're talking about a territory in the early 1980s that had to close its door, and I didn't have to start the section by saying, and then Vince McMahon. A few years later in 1985, and Joe's Winterland Arena would be demolished. And as for the Cow Palace, in the years since, even after the AWA, the Cow Palace would still continue to hold some great professional wrestling events, such as WCW Super Brawl in 1997, as well as WWE's No Way Out. And not to mention New Japan's G1 special in San Francisco in 2018, and most recently, the venue also got to host that of All Elite Wrestling. Well, there you go, the history of Big Time Wrestling San Francisco. What are some of your favorite moments from the Cow Palace? Let me know down in the comment section, and please make sure that you like this video and that you're subscribed to the Thinking Fans channel. Thank you so much again for watching, and thank you to all my amazing Patreon supporters. And as always, Dave knows.